Far from any towns or highways, in one of the most isolated desert locations of the Southwest, lies a lonely canyon called Chaco. It was here 1,000 years ago that powerful dynasties ruled an area the size of Ohio. They left behind impressive stone monuments, beautiful artwork, and tantalizing clues about what they were up to. Join me as I explore Chaco Canyon and try to make sense of the clues found here to understand just what in the heck was going on out here in the desert 1,000 years ago. I'm starting my journey today here, about 100 miles south of Chaco, because I want to show you what was going on in those days, to get a clue about what life was like for the average person in that Chacoan era. And so I'm at this ruin here, and it's built in a very defensive location. As you can see, it's right on top of this huge hill. It's very, very high, and it's got steep cliffs on all sides. So this would be a very easy area to defend. Not only is it built on a high mesa, there's walls, there's defensive walls going down the backside of the mesa where they would have accessed the village from. There's a number of different sets of walls going down. So they were obviously here because they were afraid of something, or more specifically, they were afraid of someone. All right, let's talk really quick about how I date a site like this, because I haven't dug it. I haven't done tree ring dating or carbon dating. How do I go about figuring out what the age is? How do I know if this site is contemporary with Chaco? It's really actually pretty simple once you learn a little bit about the pottery of this area. The types of pottery, over the course of time, over centuries, evolved into different types. And so you can usually, as long as you can see what kind of pottery they were making and using, you can get a pretty good idea of the age of the site. So I was just at a site 2 days ago that had lots of black on white pottery, but no corrugated, zero. What does that tell me? That tells me that that site dates to before 1000 AD, because corrugated didn't become common until, I don't know, 1025, 1050 AD, something like that. So that site was obviously pre-Chacoan, or maybe just about the time Chaco was rising. This site has lots of corrugated, but it doesn't have redwares. Redwares became popular just about the time that the Chaco system kind of fell apart. And so the lack of redwares, but the abundance of corrugated tells me this site is contemporary with Chaco Canyon. This village is built on the periphery of that area that was controlled by a powerful elite class of people that ruled from Chaco Canyon. Some experts believe that Chaco, like many other rulers in the past, used fear and terror to keep people in line. Instances of horrible violence were actually quite common during that Chaco era. But ironically, average villages were smaller and less defensively built during that time, which seems to indicate that as long as you followed the rules, you had nothing to worry about. Think of the Roman Empire. The average person enjoyed the Pax Romana, but those that went against Rome had a lot to worry about. And that seems to be the case with this village. This village, on the very periphery of Chaco's control, was concerned, very concerned about something. And Chaco had the organizational ability to arrange terrible things to happen to those people that went up against their power. Yet, this wasn't the Roman Empire. All they had as a means of transportation and communication was foot travel. So how does a civilization out in this rugged desert landscape control such a large area just by foot? I'm going to take you to another site now that helps explain how they did that. Chaco projected power throughout the region with a series of great houses known as Chacoan outliers, like this one behind me. Think of them like castles of minor lords who collect the tribute from the local peasants and in turn pay tribute to the king in the capital. Now let's talk about what makes a great house different from the houses of the common people. Great houses have massive masonry. They have multiple stories, whereas the common house is usually one story. They have elevated kivas, that is, the kivas are not sunken into the ground as is common elsewhere. Great houses are often built on commanding heights, up high so everybody can see it. There's often a nearby great kiva to a great house. Now, we'll talk more about great kivas coming up. Usually great houses have extensive berms. Now, these are berms that are in the area around the great house. I don't see any at this site, but we'll look at some when we get to Chaco Canyon and talk more about those. Often great houses have connecting roads that lead back to Chaco Canyon, roads that lead on to other great houses. And finally, they have a more formal planned layout, whereas the common houses are rather haphazardly built. The great houses are usually laid out in a more formal, like an architect designed layout. In contrast, the common man usually lived in what's called a small house or a unit pueblo, and that's like 5 to 6 rooms and a kiva. These are almost always 1 story, seldom more than 1 story in height. The walls are 1 stone width wide, whereas the walls we see here at this great house are about 2 stones wide, and we'll see some when we get to Chaco Canyon that are much wider than that. And then again, that unit pueblo has more of a informal kind of organic layout. There are usually unit pueblos near every great house. Chacoan outliers like this one are all over the region around Chaco Canyon. In fact, there are over 150 known Chaco outliers that spread out in a circle at least 90 miles from Chaco Canyon in all directions. One of the clues about the power that resided in these great houses is the imbalance of genders. There are more women in the great houses and more men in the commoners' villages. I imagine communications between these outliers and the capital city would have been very important for maintaining order. And yet they had no horses. In fact, they had no means of transportation faster than human feet. So how did they do it? They developed a very impressive line-of-sight communication system. And I'm going to travel to another site now to show you how that works. The existence of this line-of-sight communication system is hard to prove, but there are some tantalizing clues, and many archaeologists are convinced it existed. For one thing, these outliers were often built on high points, in sight of other outliers. In fact, studies have shown that 80% of outliers are in sight of at least one other outlier. Another thing is, fire hearths have been discovered on top of high points around the region. Some believe these are where signal fires were lit. One of those locations is on top of Warfano Butte behind me here. Can you imagine somebody sitting on one of these high places, looking, scanning the horizon for signals at all times? It must have been a very weighty and boring responsibility that somebody had. But line-of-sight communications was not the only way that the outliers had of communicating with the capital. There was also an entire network of roads. These are 30-foot wide engineered roads that go in a straight line across the landscape, up and down hills. When they get to cliff faces, they usually go down or up via stairways or ramps. These are sometimes dug into the ground and other times are lined with stone curbs. Over 150 miles of these roads have been discovered by aerial photography and ground survey. But seriously, why would somebody that had no wheeled vehicles and no beasts of burden need a 30-foot wide road? Some have considered that these may have been used also as ceremonial procession ways or in the movement of troops. So now that we have a better idea about the general Chaco region, let's follow one of these roads to the center of the Chaco world, an area that is sometimes called downtown Chaco. There are at least a half a dozen really great houses here in the heart of Chaco Canyon. It is believed by some that each was home to a different ruling family and that the kingship rotated between them. This is the way it was done in some parts of ancient Mexico. And as we will see, this area had a lot of influence from Mexico. From here, at the edge of the canyon, where the Great North Road enters the canyon, we can see a couple of the largest pueblos, Pueblo del Arroyo and the largest building in the Pueblo world, Pueblo Bonito. Many people have wondered why you would build this here in this remote desert area. It doesn't make sense. It's not fertile land where you think you would want to build your capital city. But there's a couple of good reasons. One is that it's not quite as desolate as you think. The erosion you see in the canyon behind you was caused by overgrazing in the early 1900s. Before that, it was a broad, shallow valley. Early pioneers described the channel as about 18 inches deep and about 8 feet wide. So With a shallow ditch like that, you could move that water around in ditches for irrigation. You could impound it behind reservoirs. You had a lot more options. And they did farm this valley. Also, look at the Hopi mesas. If you look at the Hopi mesas, you might say the same thing. You could never grow people here. This is desolate country. But yet the Hopis have done it for centuries and continue to do it today. The thing is, if you have the right seeds and the right techniques, you can grow food in places like this. The other thing is, Chaco Canyon is central to a much larger region. The region that the Chacoans controlled included a lot more fertile areas, places like the San Juan River Valley to the north, the Chusca Mountains to the west, and the Zuni Mountains to the south. And all of those areas were much more fertile, and they all sent things into here. And so they were accumulating food and other goods here in Chaco Canyon from all these areas. If one of those areas had a bad year, didn't produce enough corn that year, for example, in the Zuni Mountains, maybe they didn't have a bad year up on the San Juan River, and they could send extra food down to Zuni and kind of redistribute that food. And so this is a good central location for that. They estimate that there were between 2,500 to 3,000 people living here in Chaco Canyon. That is the maximum population. So it's really not that big if you think about it. Although these buildings are large and there's a lot of rooms, they don't believe there was a lot of people living in each of them. And that is because they can tell which rooms were lived in if they have a fire pit. A lot of the rooms in these large great houses had no fire pit, so they don't believe people lived in a lot of them. Also trash, they don't find a lot of trash. They don't find a lot of burials. That again says not that many people lived here. So they were large buildings, but a lot of that was show, a lot of that was maybe storage, and then again, these royal families maybe lived there and bounced around in there and looked great living there, but didn't use it all. I already know I'm going to get comments like, oh, you're wrong, you got it all wrong, here's what really happened. You have to understand that archaeology is all about interpretation. Different archaeologists interpret it differently. It's kind of like a criminal investigation, right? The detective goes out and collects all the clues, and then the lawyer has to present it in a certain way, has to interpret those clues in a certain way and present it to the jury. You can have all the best clues in the world pointing to a particular guy, but if that lawyer doesn't interpret them right or present it to the jury in the right way, then someone that's guilty can still go free. When it comes to interpreting archaeology, sometimes what's the most popular interpretation isn't always the right one. Maybe it was just presented in a good way. So I know that some of you are going to think I'm wrong, and that's okay. And go ahead and leave those comments, telling me what you think. That's fine. But don't be a jerk about it. Remember that it's open to interpretation. These are just somebody's interpretations. Some of these are mine. Most of these ideas that I'm presenting today are things that I got from an archaeologist named Lekson, who spent a good part of his career studying Chaco and has some really great ideas. He's also a really good author, so his books are interesting to read. I will link a couple of Lekson's books in the doobly-doo so you can go there and kind of study up on it and learn more. Keep in mind that it's all just interpretation, and this is partially Lekson's views, partially mine. It's just somebody's interpretation of what happened here based on the evidence. And the truth is, there's a lot of things you can't prove with archaeology, so there's a lot of things that we may never know the truth of what happened here, because it's all just speculation based on the clues we have. Welcome to Pueblo, Bonito, the greatest ancient ruin in the American Southwest. It covers over 3 acres, contains 650 rooms and 39 kivas, and reached 5 stories in height. It's built in a massive D shape and took an estimated 805,000 man-hours to build. I could probably go on all day about Pueblo Bonito, but I'm going to limit myself to 3 items that I want to tell you about. 1, the burials of room 33. 2, the cylinder jars of room 28. And 3, threatening rock that demolished a big part of this ruin. What you're looking at here is room 33 of Pueblo Bonito. A very small room in the oldest part of the Pueblo. It was a sealed chamber in which 14 individuals were buried over a 330-year period, roughly 700 to 1030. Here's what makes these burials remarkable. The burials were accompanied by an extraordinary array of grave goods, including over 56,000 turquoise beads and pendants. That's more turquoise than was found in all other archaeological sites in the American Southwest combined. Thousands of shell beads and rare items like abalone shell and macaw feathers, indicating long-distance trade with regions as far as Mexico. DNA studies revealed that 9 of the individuals were part of a matrilineal lineage sharing the same mitochondrial DNA. This suggests a hereditary elite, possibly a ruling family that maintained power across generations. A total of 210 cylinder jars have been found in the Chaco region. Of that 210, 173 came from room 28. This is the place where those cylinder jars, where they were ritually stored and used for a time. Patricia Crown, an archaeologist with University of New Mexico, studied these cylinder jars and found the residue of chocolate in them. So they were consuming chocolate in these cylinder jars. Chocolate that was traded north out of Mexico over 1,200 miles. But something happened. Something changed around 1100. They decided not to use these cylinder jars anymore. This room with the 173 cylinder jars in it was ritually burned. You can see the red in the sandstone in the walls, and that is oxidation from the hot fire. After that, it was sealed up and not used, and they didn't use cylinder jars anymore after that. They drank their chocolate out of mugs and other forms after that. They continued to use chocolate, but that was the end of using cylinder jars. This 97-foot high monolith, weighing approximately 30,000 tons, known as Threatening Rock, loomed over the rear wall of the Great House for centuries. The Chacoans were aware of the danger. In fact, they engineered structural reinforcements, including a series of masonry walls and buttresses that propped up the slab. But despite everyone's best efforts, on January 22, 1941, Threatening Rock finally gave way, crashing into the northern section of Pueblo Bonito, burying 20 to 30 rooms and damaging a significant portion of the rear wall, as you can see here. They found prayer sticks behind Threatening Rock. These are known as pajos in modern Puebloan traditions. They're small, ritually crafted wooden sticks, often decorated with feathers, paint, or other materials, used as offerings to communicate with spiritual forces or ancestors. So the Puebloans that lived here knew that Threatening Rock was a threat to their home, and they made efforts, both physical and spiritual, to protect it. Despite that, it came crashing down in 1941. Fortunately, I understand most of those rooms had already been excavated before that happened, so the goods that were in those rooms was saved. The wall was not. Okay, let's talk about a couple of the architectural features. So these low mounds right behind me here are called berms. Most great houses have these berms, and archaeologists at first thought these were trash mounds. But then they dug into them and found out that there's some trash there, but they're largely construction debris, a little bit of trash, and just earth. And they were flattened on top and capped with adobe. And so nobody's really sure at this point, what they were used for, what they might have looked like back in the day, but there's these low mounds around all of these great houses. Perhaps, it was a place where somebody could speak to a large group of people or perform ceremonies that a large group of people could look at because they were elevated. We don't know, but they are part of great house architecture. The circular room behind me is called a kiva, and the name comes from the Hopi word for their ceremonial rooms. A lot of people have made the assumption that these are similar to those ceremonial rooms that are in many pueblos today. But that's not necessarily so. The argument has been made by some that after about 1300 AD, the function of these subterranean rooms, or kivas, may have changed. Pueblo Bonito began to be built around 850 AD. At that time, Puebloan people had relatively recently begun to live in above-ground pueblos. For that time, they had lived in below-ground pit houses for centuries. And at the time Pueblo Bonito was first constructed, some villages were still living in these pit houses. Many see the kiva as an obvious evolution of pit houses, having a similar shape, similar position below ground, and many similar features. But the real kicker is this. Before about 1300, there were many more kivas per capita than there were after or there are today. Let me give you some numbers. Pueblo Bonito had a maximum population of about 800 people and 39 kivas. That's one kiva to every about 21 people. Here are the figures for a few other prehistoric and modern pueblos. You will see that the number of kivas per capita is much lower in the historic pueblos than in the ancient ones. And that is why some people think that these kivas at Chaco were used as habitations and not as ceremonial chambers back in those days. This behind me is a different kind of circular structure. It's called a great kiva. It has some similarities with a kiva and also some differences. They're often associated with great houses. This is Pueblo Bonito, and there's 2 great kivas in Pueblo Bonito. But they aren't always associated with great houses. Many times they aren't even associated with an individual village, but rather they're often located at a central location between several villages. That seems to indicate that this would function as a central meeting place for ceremonies, but also perhaps for community meetings. There are certain features that are found in most great kivas. First of all, obviously, a great kiva is quite a bit larger than a regular kiva. Great kivas often have these wall niches you see. They also have these square stone features on the floor you can see here. Some archaeologists believe these would have had boards placed over them and function as foot drums. Another common feature are these 4 stone circles you see. These held large pine log pillars that supported the roof. Now the beams are interesting because there's no timber here around Chaco Canyon, so all of the wood, the big beams that are holding the ceilings up in all these rooms are brought in from like 40 or 50 miles away. So somebody has to travel out there, cut down the trees with a stone axe, and then leave them sit for like a year or 2 so the wood dries out. They've all got to be limbed and debarked, and then cut to length, and then carried like 40 or 50 miles back to Chaco Canyon from there. So a lot of work, a lot of work went into building these things and getting the materials that they needed. Of course, the stone all comes from locally. These cliffs here are full of the sandstone that it's built from, but a lot more labor goes into it when you start thinking about the wood especially. Behind me is the largest great kiva in Chaco Canyon, known as Casa Rinconada. And as I said, these great kivas aren't always associated with the village. There are 2 in Pueblo Bonito. This one sits all by itself over here on the other side of the canyon. So that side of the canyon is kind of the high rent district. All of the great houses are on the same side of the canyon. On this side, there's a lot of what they call small house villages. These are places where the common people lived. And so this was kind of over here in an area where there's a number of these small house pueblos nearby, and probably served as kind of a communal gathering point on this side of the canyon. And so now I'm going to show you a great kiva that's been restored. So this is up in Aztec Ruins National Monument, which is a few miles north of here. And they've restored this great kiva to what they think it might have looked like back in the day. And it's really nice, I think, to get a visual idea of what these were like, because when you look at the ruins, it's sometimes hard to grasp what these might have been like in their original state. And so now that we've kind of seen the lifestyles of the rich and famous in Chaco Canyon, the great houses, let's take a look at how the common man lived. Okay, so first of all, this is one of those, what they call small houses, right, as opposed to a great house. And you can see the poorer workmanship in the walls. These are 1 story instead of 2, 3, 4, 5 as we have across the wash. They're pretty humble houses. The rooms are quite a bit smaller as well. But this goes back to what I was saying about kivas. There are 5 kivas in this little house. Now, if that was a ceremonial room, it would make no sense. Why would you want 5 of them? And there's almost as many kivas as there are square, ordinary rooms. So I think, kivas need to be rethought. But at any rate, this is where, the people who were the craftsmen, who were building those great houses probably lived. These are probably the ones who are the farmers who were tending the crops of corn, beans, and squash in the valley floor here. These are the ones that were doing the hard work day by day to make this place what it is. They're not much to look at. They're pretty ordinary. Houses like this, pueblos like this are scattered all across northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, southern Utah. So people don't drive all the way out here on this dirt road to see ruins like this, but they're very important because, as I said, these are the ones that made that possible. These are the guys that were carrying those heavy timbers 40 miles by hand from the mountains. I read that there were probably 2,500 to 3,000 people living here in Chaco Canyon at the peak of its population. And of that, about half were the elites in the great houses. The other half were the workers living in these small houses over here. Gives you an idea of how many of them there were. And they say these small houses are scattered up and down the canyon on this side. There's only these few here near Casa Rinconada that are actually open, and available to the public. But there's a lot more that just, people don't even look at. The archaeologists don't look at them because they're not that impressive. One of the things I didn't realize before I visited Chaco Canyon was how close together these great houses are in the center of what is called downtown Chaco. You first arrive at the visitor center after crossing about 7 miles of the worst roads you have ever seen. This visitor center has the distinction of being, as far as I know, the only National Park Service visitor center at an historical site with no artifacts present. That's right, none. From here it is a short half-mile to the first great house you can see, called Una Vida. Moving west down the canyon from Una Vida to the next great house, which is called Hungopavi, is about 2 miles. Another 2 miles west brings us into the heart of downtown Chaco, Chaco, one of the largest great houses with over 400 rooms. From here, it is barely any distance at all to Pueblo Bonito, less than a half-mile away, which, as we have discussed, was the largest and oldest of the great houses in Chaco Canyon. Continuing west another quarter of a mile brings us to another of the larger great houses, Pueblo del Arroyo, with over 300 rooms. Another quarter mile farther on takes us to Quincletso, a somewhat smaller great house with 55 rooms. And let's not forget that these are all along the north side of the canyon. Across the canyon from here is the great kiva of Casa Rinconada, along with many small house pueblos. And just a half-mile north of the canyon here lies Pueblo Alto with 89 rooms. So, although each great house can be thought of as its own community, really, because they are so close together, all of these great houses together comprise one large community, like a city, a capital that exerts influence on a wide area across the region. So they started building Pueblo Bonito about 850 AD, and it took a while for things to get rolling. 200 years before you really get into the point where Chaco was having a lot of influence on a wide area. So Pueblo Bonito started 850. The ruin I'm in here is Chaco, that started about 900. It wasn't until about 1050 that things really got rolling. And that's when they were having the most influence on the wider area. That's when a lot of those Chacoan outliers were being built all around the area. And that's when a lot of that violence was taking place. And I kind of skimmed that over earlier, but let me show you what Lekson says about the violence that was going on at that time. The northern southwest, Chaco's region, had become notorious for instances of horrible violence. Whole communities, grandparents, families, kids, everyone, executed, chopped to bits, occasionally eaten, and then tossed en masse into a kiva or a room. Isolated events like this may have happened as early as the 6th century, but they happened repeatedly, perhaps even frequently, during Chaco's time, especially between 1020 and 1180. And that was that time when Chaco was having the most influence. That was when things were really going well. During that period of building here from 850 to 1150, there was probably almost no time in this valley when there wasn't some construction project going on. If you look at the amount of buildings here today, they probably had something going on at all times, and sometimes many projects going on at the same time, a hive of activity. Really, I think the magic thing, the amazing thing that the Chacoans did wasn't the construction so much. It was the organization, the ability to organize people and get these things done. Because right before Chaco, they were just simple farmers living in isolated villages. And suddenly to come together and organize people to accomplish these massive structures, that's really the magic of Chaco in my mind. Chaco's, heyday was, say, 1050 to 1180. At the end of that period, that was it. 100 years was all they had at their peak. And then things started to fall apart. They say there was a drought in the 1100s that impacted it and made the system kind of collapse. But, if you look at history and you look at empires that fell apart or collapsed, large movements of people, sometimes there's natural causes in there, but usually there's some political things going on as well, and that's kind of the motivator. And so probably there was some politics involved as well, and archaeology has a hard time seeing those kind of things. But something was definitely happening in the 1100s. I think the first clue was the burning of that room with the cylinder jars in 1100. They were rejecting the cylinder jars. They were rejecting whatever those cylinder jars represented. And even that room that was sealed up, they were rejecting that at that time. So that shows that they were making changes in their culture at that time. And it wasn't until like 1120 that things really started to fall apart. So that was right there. Right around that time, 1120, is when a lot of these building projects stopped in the valley. And that's another sign. When the construction of the great houses and all these other construction projects stopped, that showed that something was changing, something was happening here, something political that we have trouble seeing, right? And then they built another capital in the north. That's what they call Aztec ruin. Now, it has nothing to do with the Aztecs, it's just called that, but they moved the capital up there, and then the Chaco region contracted. It got quite a bit smaller after that time. And eventually that collapsed too, but that's a subject for another video. But by the 1200s, this area was completely abandoned and everybody had left. A lot of them had gone to Aztec, but a lot of them had gone to all places in all different directions as well, I'm sure. If you're interested in seeing more about those cylinder jars, I recreated one of those Chaco and cylinder jars last year perfectly. And I talked more about that room that was full of cylinder jars, went into more detail. If you'd like to see that, I'll link that video up right over here. I appreciate you coming with us today. I'll catch you next time.